So I have a question for you this morning.
Bring it on.
I was unimpressed with that book. Sorry. My question is this. Did you, as a child, have a childhood hero?
Yes.
Who was it?
Superman.
Superman. Your older sister, Julia. Anybody else? Glenn Campbell. Okay. If you don't know who that is, you can ask Vance later. The Rhinestone Cowboy. Anybody else? Wonder Woman. I like that one. Anybody else? Oh no. Lance Armstrong. I was going to say, you didn't look like a baseball fan. My childhood hero was an imaginary character. My childhood hero was MacGyver. I loved MacGyver. MacGyver could get out of any situation with what he had inside of his brain and his Swiss Army knife. And a little bit of string, but he didn't have to carry that with him. He could find it. Yeah, he was always laying around. I remember one time he escaped from this compound by tying string onto his Swiss Army knife and using that to unlatch the gate. I remember another time where he welded something back together using nickels and jumper cables, which I don't know. At the time, I didn't know anything about welding. It just seemed really impressive to me. Really honestly, I am a lot like MacGyver. He has a way cooler hair than I do. But I have been known to come up with some pretty resourceful solutions to problems. I didn't realize until a lot later, like in the last 2 years, how much this childhood hero of mine said about me. I don't know about you, if you've ever pondered what your fatal flaw is, but I've realized in the last couple of years that my fatal flaw is actually how resourceful I am. I actually realized in the last couple of years, I avoid at all costs the need to ask for help. I avoid at all costs the feeling of having to rely on other people. And it actually doesn't take that long of sitting on a therapist's couch for you to recognize why that is. I grew up with a dad who wasn't there and wasn't available and wasn't trustworthy. And so I had to find ways to solve my problems without going and relying on other people. I think in a lot of ways we all have both these heroes, these icons that we create for ourselves, and also these things that, I don't know, maybe you're not at the point in your life yet where you have recognized that thing that you think is your superpower is actually coming from the place of trauma and brokenness in your life. But you'll get there. Don't worry. You'll get there. I think we've all been in that place where we've had to pivot and move in a different direction to try to figure out how we're going to move forward, how we're going to get out of this bind, how we're going to solve this problem. And that's a scary place. I don't like it. I don't like being in that situation. When I'm in that situation, what I start doing is I start looking around on the ground for string, for nickels, jumper cables. My first reaction is not usually to ask other people for help, nor is it to ask, it's not for me to say, God, I need you right now. It's for me to rely on myself, rely on my own capabilities, rely on my own ingenuity, rely on my own way of solving a problem. Does anybody else relate to that at all? There are times, though, where you're at the end of the string. See what I did there, Bing? You're at the end of the string. You're desperate. You actually can't solve the problem that you're in. You've actually tried to solve the problem that you're in, and it's not working. Nothing is working. All of your resources are spent. All of your ingenuity is tapped. And that's a vulnerable place to be. That's a place that none of us want to find ourselves. And yet, when we look at this story that we're going to be looking at this morning in the book of Mark, this is where the characters in this story find themselves. And as it turns out, it was exactly where they needed to be. This story comes just on the heels of the story that we looked at last week. Last week, Jesus crossed over the lake, crossed over the Sea of Galilee. And really, the only agenda that he had over there is to go and find this guy. Heal him. This guy was beyond the point of asking for prayer. Like, he couldn't ask for help. He was just a mess. And I love the part of the story where Jesus finds it important enough to just pick up, brave the storm, go across the sea, and release this man from the prison that he's in. Release this man from the torment that he's in. He makes that effort. So this happens on this side of the lake, and Jesus crosses over to the other side of the lake, and as soon as he gets there, there's a crowd. It's chaos on the other side of the lake. People are like frantically trying to get at Jesus. They see that he's doing crazy things. Like, there are things that they've never seen before that Jesus is doing. There are things that they've never experienced before. Things that they had not even dared to hope for that Jesus was doing. And this crowd, you got to keep in mind, like, Jesus crossed the lake to the other side of the lake. He was tired then. He was a little run down then. He was, and then he comes back across the lake, and everybody's closing in around him. He's had this crazy busy week of ministry, of doing what God has called him to do. And you know, it would be nice to have a little downtime, wouldn't it? Every once in a while. Jesus gets to the other side of the lake, and there's a crowd waiting for him. And they're pressing in on all sides. Jesus doesn't have that opportunity. And in the crowd, from the crowd, comes a man. And this man has a lot riding on his reputation. He is somebody. He has other people look to him. People value what he has to say. But his little girl is sick. And he's afraid. A man named Jairus, he came and fell at Jesus' feet. He came and fell at Jesus' feet, weeping. He was desperate. He was desperate. He pleaded earnestly, the text says, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." Can you, just for a second, tap into that emotion? This man's desperate. His daughter is about to die. He's afraid. He presents himself. I'm sure at this point, if she's about to die and she's sick, I'm sure he's exercised every resource that he has available to try and make his daughter well. And he falls down at the feet of Jesus. I'm not sure what he believes about this man, other than that he's seen some crazy stuff that's happening. And so he makes himself vulnerable. Verse 24. Says Jesus went with him. And this crowd doesn't dissipate. The crowd just presses in and becomes the entourage. Jesus follows him, and the crowd pressed in. And in the middle of this crowd, in the middle of this story, in the middle of what's happening here, there's an interruption. Can you imagine being this man in the crowd? The crowd is impeding your movement. Hey, have you ever been really trying to get out of an event, and you're trying to make your way through the crowd, and just the crowd is just everything about it? It's that leaving Red Rocks experience. It's the leaving the fireworks display experience. Trying to get out, trying to get home, trying to get the kids to bed or whatever. That's what's happening. This crowd is pressing in. And this woman in the crowd interrupts the procession. Can you just I imagine at this point in the story, Jairus is gritting his teeth, clenching his jaw. Don't mess this up for me. And what Jairus would love for Jesus to do is to brush this thing off. Move on, move past. Keep going, press forward, solve the problem, get out of here so we can take care of it. And there's this woman. When she had heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. See, this woman had a illness that had kept her on the outskirts, kept her from being included in community, kept her from being included in family. She had an issue of blood. This woman was not allowed to be a part of anything. And she, also desperate, also expended all of the resources that she had, also put everything into trying to solve this problem, and she risks everything in that moment. Like, she's not supposed to be here. She's supposed to stay away from the crowd. She's facing potential punishment by even being here. And she's crawling her way through the crowd, crawling her way, just desperate for relief. She reaches out. Jewish law states that anything a woman in her condition touches becomes unclean. She's desperately crawling through this crowd. Yeah, that's crazy, isn't it? And she reaches out and touches Jesus by the edge of his cloak, the edge of his garment. She makes this Jesus' problem. If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was free from her suffering. Her condition prior to this made her an outsider. Her condition made her an outcast. Her condition made her unclean. Her condition defined who she was. This didn't happen like for this week or this month. For 12 years she's experienced this. By this point, she was her condition. That was the primary thing that defined who she was. That was the primary thing that communicated to her and to everyone else about her worth and her value. But she heard about Jesus. She heard about Jesus. I said this last week, and I think we take it for granted if we haven't recently been desperate. We take for granted how dangerous hope is. We take for granted that feeling of like, I don't want to get my hopes up. I don't want to believe that I don't have to be MacGyver this time. I don't want to believe that I don't have to find my own way out of this pickle. But she heard about Jesus. She came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She was terrified in that moment. She was terrified of being revealed, terrified of being exposed. So terrified that she was unwilling to come and ask Jesus for help. She couldn't verbalize the words. She couldn't command an audience with him to solve this problem. And I want you to keep in the back of your mind while this is happening, this scene is happening. Jairus is standing over here, steam coming out of his ears. He's also afraid. He is also scared. She believed. I think sometimes we have this idea about believing, that it's this intellectual thing that like you just, I believe that this thing is true. You're all believing right now. You're sitting in a chair that you believe will hold you. You're sitting under a roof that you believe won't cave in on you. It's an intellectual thing. This is beyond that. This is beyond an intellectual thing. This is, I have no other options. I have no other place. I have no other hope. This is a let go. She pressed forward, ignoring long-standing societal conventions, and touched the hem of Jesus' robe, even knowing that doing so could and very likely would lead to further shame and humiliation. When she did, two things happened simultaneously. Immediately, she was freed from her suffering. I don't think I've ever really wrestled with that short little phrase, freed from her suffering. Her suffering wasn't just her condition. It was everything that had compiled and piled on for 12 years. Immediately, she was freed from her suffering. Her condition was gone. The second thing that happened is that Jesus stops in his tracks. He stops. At once, Jesus realized that the power had gone out from him. He turned around to the crowd and asks this question. I think these are my favorite parts of stories. These little tidbits. Like Jesus turns around to the crowd and he says, "Who touched my clothes?" And the disciples respond the way that you are right now. They're like, "You see the people crowding against you? How can you ask, 'Who touched me?'" Jesus is like, "No, something happened. Something happened in this moment." Like Jesus could have kept going. He could have stopped. He could have ignored this experience. He could have kept going. That's what Jairus wants to happen. Jairus wants Jesus to keep going, but Jesus stops. This moment can't go unnoticed, because this is also a part of her healing. He goes on and he says in verse 32, Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, and told him the whole truth. Can you imagine this moment? This woman has had years of shame piled on her. Years of hopelessness piled on her. The potential for a moment of intense shame does not overrule her desire to experience healing. And in that moment, Jesus turns around. She says, "It was me. I did it." She's ready. She's ready for the backlash. But that's not what happens. Jesus looks at her. And we read this passage, and I think if we're not careful, we're going to miss how impactful the way that what Jesus says to her. For 12 years, she's been nobody's daughter. For 12 years, she's been a part of nobody's family. For 12 years, she's been included in no community, in no relationship, in no inside group. Jesus turns to her and he says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Okay, end scene. Jairus is still standing there. I think he can feel a little bit that this is a cool moment, but it's like watching someone else win the lottery, right? You see this, I'm in this desperate situation, and you see this happening, you're like, that's really cool, I'm really excited for this person, but also my daughter is still dying. And in that moment, a messenger comes. A messenger from Jairus' house comes into the scene. And before the messenger even opens his mouth, Jairus knows what the message is. Before he even opens his mouth, he knows what the message is. And he says, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" And this is why hope is dangerous. It's emotional whiplash. Why bother? I can't fathom this answer, like this messenger. Like, don't bother the teacher anymore. Go home. And Jesus hears what's happening. Jesus hears this in a little interchange. He sees the shoulders slump. He sees the disappointment, the grief. And Jesus whispers to him, and he says, "Don't be afraid. Just believe." Again, that's not an intellectual thing. That's not a do the math and believe. That's a let go thing. Don't be afraid, just believe. And Jesus goes. Immediately from here, Jesus goes into the house. He doesn't let anybody follow him. He doesn't let anybody go with him, except for Peter, James, and John. They get the front row seat. They get the front row seat in all of the areas. Jesus does really amazing things, and they still say dumb stuff all the time. Like, they see more than anyone else, and they still struggle to believe. And that makes me feel really good about myself. They go in. There's a commotion. People are crying and wailing. It's not a false alarm. It's real. She's gone. He went in and said to them, "Why?" And sometimes Jesus' response, like if you're in that moment, like we read this story, we pass through this story, we go through it. When you're in this moment, sometimes Jesus' response just makes you want to cuss. Jesus is like, "Why all of the commotion? What's going on here?" And then, "The child is not dead, but asleep." Okay, here's the thing. This was a long time ago, but they still knew how to tell when people were dead. They knew when it was over. Jesus says to them, don't worry, she's not dead, she's just asleep. I'm in that situation. I'm not happy. I'm not happy about this interaction. I'm not happy about this. Like, I've already moved on to the solving the problem myself. I tried the asking for help. I tried the hoping thing. I'm already backing out of this situation. Jesus goes in. Verse 40. They laughed at him. He puts everybody out of the house. He kicks everybody out. He took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. This is a tender moment. Jesus takes her hand. Talitha kume. Little girl, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders. This is a very Mark thing. He gave strict orders to not let anyone know about this. And then they told her to give her something to eat. She's hungry. Dying will take it out of you. The commotion outside, the laughing crowd at Jesus. Keep it quiet. There's this verse in Isaiah. And this verse in Isaiah, in hindsight, we're able to really see, we're able to really pull in this imagery that Isaiah prophesies 300 years before Jesus' time. We were able to see this passage in all of its glory. It says, surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. I've never been a woman. Just full disclosure. I've never experienced what this woman went through. I've never experienced what Jairus went through. In their culture, women weren't worth a whole lot. They didn't have a lot of value in the first place. But her condition further solidified. I can, on some small level, relate to the desperation, though. Maybe not that as deep as she experiences, but I can relate to that. God, I need you to show up. I need you to answer my prayer. I've been in the place where I've tried everything. And I think we've all been in that place where we've tried everything to relieve our suffering, our pain, our shame, our humiliation. Even today, Jesus calls us out of our identity of humiliation and shame. It's interesting when you're in that place, that desperation place, that place of brokenness, you get to the point where that's all you see. There isn't anything else. There isn't tomorrow. If there is a tomorrow, it's dark and gray. It's really hard to imagine something bigger, something better, something brighter, something more hopeful. But even in that, Jesus calls out to our identity of humiliation and shame and wants to give us a new identity. Daughter, son, child. He makes this exchange when we reach out for him. This story, and so many of the others, fits the portrait of Jesus, who rather than rejecting humanity's ultimate humiliation and shame, embraces it on the cross, but then exchanges that identity of humiliation and shame for the identity as daughters and sons through the resurrection. It's time for us to be desperate. Here's the good news. I have good news for you. You don't have to wait until it hits the fan to trust Jesus. You don't have to wait until plan B is no longer an option to trust Jesus. You don't have to wait until things get so ugly they're unrecognizable to trust Jesus. You don't have to wait until things are absolutely hopeless to put your trust in Jesus. The beautiful thing is that when you reach out to Jesus, he is faithful to respond. The love and tenderness that Jesus shows this woman in this moment of vulnerability, the love and tenderness that Jesus shows this little girl and her father in this moment, Jesus extends that to you also. I'd like to invite the worship team back up. If you're here and you're either desperate or ready to just believe, that let go kind of believe, not the intellectual kind of believe, not the trying to resolve all of the conflicts about the things, but just the let go kind of believe. I just want to invite you this morning, whether you're here in person, whether you're online, let go. It's in that moment. It's in that moment that the sun starts to come up. It's in that moment that dreams begin to start again. It's in that moment that we can begin to see past this horizon. Yeah, and like I said, you don't have to wait. You don't have to wait till things are so difficult that they're unbearable. it's actually a lot easier if you don't. Just let go. You don't have to solve the problem on your own. Let me pray. God, I have a list of things that I've tried to take care of on my own. And God, I confess that there's still, even today, this part of me that is afraid to trust you with those things. Afraid to trust that you'll show up for me. Afraid to trust that you'll be there for me, that you'll meet my need, that you'll answer my prayer, that you'll show up. God, I confess that I am much more likely to rely on my own ingenuity than I am to rely on you. God, I invite you I reach out. Reach out for the hem of your garment. I fall on my knees. Cry out. You are the answer. You're the one I'm looking for.